phones on mobile. I request everyone to kindly to take their seats and put your phones on silent mode. Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all for a talk on G20 at the rate of 2023, the roadmap to Indian presidency by Shri V. Srinivas, Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, Government of India. The talk will be chaired by Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, G20 Chief Coordinator, Government of India and former Secretary, Foreign Secretary. To begin with, may I request Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, to kindly make her welcome remarks.
Good afternoon. May I begin by warmly welcoming our G20 Chief Coordinator, former Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla, and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General of RIS, for joining us today on the talk G20 at 2023, the Roadmap to Indian Presidency, by Shri V. Srinivas, Secretary to the Government of India. I also welcome all distinguished guests, amongst us the heads of missions, members of the diplomatic corps, the representatives of Indonesia and Italy, because it was since 1st December last year that the G-Troika, consisting of the past, current, and the incoming presidency, that is Italy, Indonesia, and India, have been working together closely to ensure consistency to further the G20 agenda. India will assume the presidency of G20 later this year in December 2022, and in 2023, the G20 Summit will be held in India for the first time, and it will be a major event in India's calendar of multilateral diplomacy. The global economy today is faced with volatility, uncertainty, and instability. The geopolitical and the geoeconomic ferment is on account of so many reasons, but it has resulted in rising energy prices and food insecurity. Moreover, the disruptions due to the pandemic have been immense. Many countries, especially the developing countries, find themselves in a difficult situation. The role of G20 as a platform connecting the world's major economies and emerging economies will be critical. They will play a critical role in shaping the global trends. And this is on account of the fact that the G20 member states represent more than 85% of global GDP, 70% of international trade, and more than 60% of the global population. Also, it would be well to recall that G20 was constituted in 1999 in the wake of the financial crisis of 1998, where countries having systemic economic influence got together as a new grouping of G20. But after that, for some years, the meetings were held at the level of finance ministers and the chairpersons of central banks. The objective was to discuss policies that would achieve international financial stability. Thereafter, it was under the shadow of the 2008 international financial and banking crisis that the first G20 summit was held. Today, the global economy is in a crisis again, and the role of G20 assumes greater significance. What does India bring to the G20 table? It is the fastest growing major economy with a large and growing consumer base. It is a leader in pharma and IT sectors. In terms of innovation, India has the third largest unicorn base in the world. In terms of the fintech sector, India has had the largest volume of digital transaction of a level of 6.28 billion UPI transactions in July 2022, So that's a large amount of transactions taking place on digital platforms. Moreover, Indian exports have been rising consistently, and last year we touched $670 billion of exports. The Indian economy is exhibiting strong macroeconomic fundamentals, a growth trend, and resilience. And India's participation in G20, what do we look at it? Our role in G20 stems from the realization that as a major developing country, India has a stake in the stability of the international economic and financial system. And as a founding member of G20, India continues to utilize this platform to bring and raise issues of vital interest, both for sustainable growth as well as those issues which impact developing countries. It will be a very busy 2023 for India from the perspective of G20. About 100 official meetings are expected to be organized under the Sherpa track, and about 40 meetings on the finance track. In addition, about 50 meetings of academics, workshops, and side events are expected to be held. So clearly, the G20 team, India, will be busy as it works with other G20 member states for bringing stability to the global economy, which is faced with numerous challenges. In its presidency, India will seek to work for meaningful outcomes to meet the challenges. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am. May I now request Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Chief Coordinator of G20 and former Secretary, to kindly give his remarks and conduct the proceedings.
Namaste and good evening. Let me at the very outset say how happy I am to be back at the Indian Council of World Affairs to chair this discussion on a topical issue, India's presidency of the G20. My grateful thanks to Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General of the ICWA, Joint Secretary Srimati Nutan Mahavar, other members of the ICWA who have organized and contributed to this meeting. When we speak of the G20 and of the many issues involved in preparations of the G20, as well as, of course, our presidency, I think there could be no better person than my good friend and colleague, Sri V. Srinivasan. We have known each other and worked closely together on a number of issues across the board over the last decade or so. But he's a man of great experience because he's been a part of our finance ministry. He's been part of the Ministry of External Affairs. He has worked in the International Monetary Fund, and he has vast experience across the board in the government of India, in the states. And I think the fact that he is working on the subject of G20 at 2023, the roadmap to the Indian presidency, I think augurs well for all of us and is good news. Srini, we are looking forward to your book as soon as possible. Let me repeat what I think some of you already know. We will be assuming the presidency of the G20 from the 1st of December. This is the first time India will hold presidency of the G20. And as such, this represents for us an important opportunity to put some of our narratives on the global agenda, but also to showcase and present the progress and development we have achieved, as well as the rich cultural heritage and diversity of India. What is the G20? I think, again, many of you know this, but just to make sure that we go over this, G20 member states collectively account for 85% of global GDP, 75% of international trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. So they are an important grouping from the point of view of sheer size of the economies and their preponderance presence economically. But the G20 also accounts for, I would say, their members include all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. It includes all G7 members. It also includes all members of BRICS. And as such, it's a very representative grouping. Now, some of us would recall that some 4 decades ago, India hosted the NAM and CHOGM summits. That's in 1983. More recently, in 2015, we hosted the India-Africa Forum Summit, and in 2018, we hosted the International Solar Alliance Summit. But of course, I think the difference between these summits that we hosted and the groupings we chaired was that these were one-off meetings. We organized summits, but the G20, as Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh pointed out, is a fairly involves fairly extensive discussions on a range of issues, mainly sectoral issues across the board. And I think overall we would be hosting up to 190 meetings in that approximately 1 year that we will hold the presidency. So it is a larger responsibility. It's also fairly extensive. It requires extensive preparation and work. And the G20 Secretariat moves from presidency to presidency. So most of the responsibility of ensuring the G20's agenda is taken forward and that its outcomes are meaningful would devolve on the country that assumes the presidency at any stage. So it is a fair amount of, I would say, responsibility. Again, Vijay has already spoken about, the attributes of India in holding the presidency. We are the largest democracy in the world. We are one of the largest economies. But we also, in many senses, have worked closely with our partners, friends, stakeholders across the globe in dealing with some of the challenges and contributing to some of the solutions that the world faces, whether it's geopolitical or geoeconomic in nature. And of course, the G20 is an important opportunity to address many of these issues. Again, Vijay has mentioned that the G20 primarily started off as a financial economic grouping, but today it is a group that looks more comprehensively at many of the issues that we deal with. Some of us would recall that it was our Prime Minister who had initially proposed the idea of a G20 summit to deal with the COVID crisis. Saudi Arabia, which was the president at that time, took up that proposal and hosted an extraordinary virtual summit, albeit. And at that time, the PM had spoken about human-centric globalization, and that the G20, for the first time, was meeting on what is essentially a humanitarian issue. That's the COVID pandemic at that time. So the focus of the G20 today is far more comprehensive than it has been in the past, and the issues that it deals with are very, very important in terms of the current issues that are there. You would recall, as I said, Saudi Arabia dealt with COVID. Italy hosted a special summit on Afghanistan, but also on food security. Indonesia's focus is on recovering from COVID. And all of us, many of us who are here, and I want to also acknowledge many of our friends from the diplomatic corps. We've worked together on many of these issues, and we have really, I would say, engaged extensively, not only domestically with all stakeholders in the different ministries and departments involved, but also think tanks, many of the non-governmental groups that have been that could contribute and have been involved traditionally with the G20, but also our international partners, both members and non-members of the G20, international organizations, and we continue those consultations in working on what would be India's priorities, what would be our focus issues, and what are really the interests of our of the other members of the G20 and the larger international community, which we have to keep in mind when we deal with issues that should be largely representative in nature. So, as G20 president, India will set the agenda for the year, identify themes and focus areas, conduct discussions, and deliver outcomes of that particular uh, meeting. We will also highlight, develop, and strengthen international support for priorities of vital importance in diverse social and economic sectors. And as I said, the G20 covers a very vast range of areas across the board. And I think all of that actually contributes to outcomes at the summit level that would be comprehensively, I would say, considered. Um, what are some of our priorities? I think, as I said, we are working towards finalizing and fine-tuning what would be our priorities. It is a consultative process, involves stakeholders across the board, but we do believe that whatever they are is important that they represent the larger interests and also some of our own ideas that could take the G20 agenda forward. Now, just to give you some examples of how issues come on the table, one of the areas that I think the world as such, the international community as such, but also the G20 has been quite preoccupied with is the issue of climate change and the actions and mitigation efforts that are important in dealing with this. And our own commitments in terms of the climate change agenda were enunciated by the Prime Minister at the COP26 summit in Glasgow when he talked about the Panch Amrit, or the five nectars that would essentially be our own commitment with regard to some of these issues. One of them, of course, was that 50% of our installed electric capacity would be met from renewable sources. We also talked about net zero by 2070, and there were other important commitments made at that time, which are today being, I would say, endorsed in the form of our nationally determined contributions at the UNFCCC. The Prime Minister has also spoken to the fact that as a country, we have been working assiduously on this issue. We have actually achieved a target of 40% energy capacity from non-fossil fuel sources 9 years before schedule, or before the time that we had committed, and that the 10% target of ethanol blending in petrol has been achieved 5 months before, again, the target that we had set for ourselves. So, whether it is the first fully solar operated airport in the world, or whether it is our commitment to make sure that our massive railway sector becomes net zero this decade, I think we are moving very fast towards achieving our climate change commitments. But at the same time, the scales that are involved in India are of a much larger magnitude. We, as a result of which, offer a very large market for clean energy technologies. At the same time, I think it's been made clear that we do need access to climate finance and technologies in order to ensure that we fulfill our commitments as 1/6 of humanity in our climate change, I would say, endorsements. And there's a lot more to it. But essentially, what we are saying also is that climate actions also would mean that we work on sustainable development. One of the SDGs, as we call it, is about sustainable consumption and sustainable production. And the Prime Minister had talked about lifestyle for environment, the concept of life. How can we use, how can we get people to themselves voluntarily come up with a movement that could ensure that we are pro-planet, in the sense that we live both in harmony with nature, as well as ensure that our consumption patterns are in conformity with our sustainable growth and development commitments. India's own traditional approach to, I would say, living in harmony with nature over a period of time has a lot to do with this. But it's also a question of holistically dealing with both human and planet health, which are interconnected. We did look at the fact that at World Environment Day this year, we spoke about a Global Initiative for Life campaign, and that also means that we should be, when we ourselves as individuals conduct ourselves, we should be both mindful and deliberate of utilization instead of being mindless and destructive in terms of consumption. So I think that is an important factor that's here. We believe that these movements, I mean, many of these pro-planet people movements can set goals that can revolutionize sectors as diverse as fishing, agriculture, wellness, dairy, dietary choices, packaging. There's a range of issues that are impacted with this aspect of dealing with climate change, sustainable production and consumption, enveloped in the overall concept of life. The other area, of course, just an example, these are examples, of course, is the digital economy. The digital economy is an important part of the G20's consideration. And like most of the developing world, India is a country that's driven by the aspirations of its youth. And our young generation, our young people are a digital generation. And whether it's our startup sector or our digital public goods, I think these are examples that we have in our own country that have been, in many senses, very successful in meeting the development and also the aspirations, development needs of our nation, the aspirations of our younger generations. And we do need to look at how we can internationalize some of these models at a scale that is acceptable. And of course, in the G20, when we talk about digital economy, we look at a new tech order that combines cross-border flows of technology, investments with development and growth aspirations. In that context, I did mention that public health has become an important area. The use of digital goods in dealing with public health issues, whether it's Arogya Setu in order to monitor, track COVID cases, or whether it is use of CoWIN platform to administer our vaccine regime, which you know has actually resulted in 2 billion vaccines being administered across the nation. I think are examples that we can take into a larger scale. We need to also work with our partners, our international partners, on the global, on a holistic global health architecture, one that in creation of mechanisms that can help us meet the challenges of future pandemics and epidemics that may come. And we already have the examples of monkeypox and other issues that could come up. We need to work from today to ensure that we have mechanisms that deal with some of these issues that arise. And of course, there are many other related issues, whether it is the interests of small, micro, and medium enterprises, small and marginal farmers, local food cultures, traditional knowledge, is a range of issues that are important for the developing world and for sustainable lifestyles that are important. So I'm mindful of the time and that we have a fairly strict timeline. I just want to conclude by saying that we, I think, have a very, very a panel that has a lot of experience. I did mention about Secretary Srinivas, who clearly, because of the fact that he has worked extensively across the board, but also because he takes a lot of interest in every aspect that he deals with. He's a person who takes very deep consideration of the issues before him. He acts very, very effectively on all the issues that have been placed, but he's also a man of initiative. I'm saying this from my personal experience of dealing with him. He comes up with initiatives that have made a difference across the board in the areas that he has worked in, whether it's textiles, whether it's finance or external affairs. And as I said, we would definitely look forward to listening to him. But also Professor Sachin Chaturvedi from the Research and Information Systems, who has been a very, very close partner of ours in preparing for our G20 presidency. And I'm glad he's also here to contribute to this session. Thank you, Vijay. And I think we're happy to take this discussion forward. And thank you for joining us.
A very good afternoon, Ambassador Harsh Shringla, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, distinguished heads of missions, members of the diplomatic community, senior officials of Government of India. I'm extremely grateful to Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General ICWA, for inviting me for this talk, G20 at 2023, the roadmap to Indian presidency. I'm also delighted that Ambassador Harsh Shringla, India's G20 Chief Coordinator, is chairing this session, and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi is the lead panelist. I must place on record my deep appreciation for Joint Secretary ICWA, Srimati Nutan Mahavar, who has strived tirelessly to make this event possible. As has been mentioned by our Chief Coordinator, India would be holding the G20 presidency from 1st December 2022. For a nation that is deeply committed to multilateralism and democracy, the G20 presidency would be a very significant moment in India's history. Since independence, India has engaged with multilateral institutions. We were founder members of the Bretton Woods institutions, founder members of the United Nations, and every other international institution we've had membership. and we have contributed significantly to combating the challenges of contemporary global governance. India's inclusive model of governance with emphasis on multilateralism promises one of the finest years of G20 leadership, wherein multilateralism can flourish and G20 can make a serious contribution to make globalization safer, sustainable, while transforming the processes of international negotiations. The Italian presidency in 2021 focused on people, planet, and prosperity. The Indonesian presidency of 2022 has focused on recovering together, recovering stronger. Prime Minister Modi has attended an average 25 meetings in each of the 8 G20 summits that he has participated. These included bilateral meetings, pull-aside meetings, of the RIC, of the JAI, BRICS groupings. He has also led the G20 for adopting more effective dealings convergent with the original purpose of promoting sustainable growth and financial stability, and also to address the global challenges such as reform of multilateral institutions, climate change, and fight against technology-driven terrorism. Today's talk, The Roadmap for the Indian Presidency of G20, highlights India's contribution to the G20 and how multilateralism can be strengthened. My own passion for G20 dates back to 2002. We last held the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in New Delhi, and I was serving as private secretary to the finance minister of India, and I was very closely associated with those deliberations at that point of time. Thereafter, I was party to the expansion of the G7 to a G20, and when the first discussion started in our G24 meetings, and I recall the Australians mentioning to me, Mr. John Murray, who went on to be the central bank governor of Australia, telling me that, have you heard that the G7 is expanding to G20 and many of us are going to be co-opted from G24 into G20? That was how the discussion set started. And by 2008, this actually became a reality. An organization was created, and it became a most significant development on the global economic horizon. It has been a passion for me to pursue the developments in G20. I've tried to follow every summit meeting for the last 18 years, every Sherpa meeting, every working group meeting, every communique of each of the 40-odd communiques that are issued by the ministers in the ministerial meetings, and have written extensively about it in my first book also. And the opportunity to present India's role in a multilateralist fora fascinates me, and that enthused me to take up this research work on G20 at 2023. So many of you would recall how bad things were in 2008, and when the global economy collapsed, nobody could believe Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapse could trigger a global economic collapse at that point of time. And the Americans wanted to create a larger fora wherein which global institutional oversight, but particularly the financial oversight, should be strengthened. And thus was born G20 from a meeting of the recommendations of the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. And it has been at the forefront of battling financial crisis, be it the global financial crisis of 2008-9, the Eurozone crisis of 2010, the COVID pandemic crisis of 2020, each of them which has taken a devastating toll of the global growth and welfare. And the G20 has stood in the front lines of the battle. And India's positions in each of these years have been and reflect a deep commitment to multilateralism and to the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Over the years, the G20's agenda has been strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. It strengthened the international financial regulatory system, strengthened the mission and governance of the International Monetary Fund, deliberated on energy security and climate change, and strengthened support for the most vulnerable countries and placed quality jobs at the heart of the recovery. They established the Financial Stability Board, and which is one of the most significant institutions for financial regulation. It also gave more quota and voice to several emerging market economies. India's quotas at the IMF and the World Bank increased, China's quotas, Brazil, Russia. So the quotas and voice of emerging market economies improved at many international fora from developed economies. And in 2020, of course, they stood at the forefront of the COVID pandemic with a bailout package of more than $10 trillion. So today, when you see the G20 agenda, as the chief coordinator has mentioned, there's a finance track, trade, healthcare, education, anti-corruption, women development, skill building, and youth promotion. It's a very large agenda to be coordinated. And we've had a series of summit meetings, Washington, D.C. in 2008, London and Pittsburgh in 2009, Toronto, Seoul, Cannes, Mexico City, Rome, Brisbane, Antalya, Hangzhou, Hamburg, Brisbane, Osaka, Riyadh, and the last one at Rome. But when you look at the history of the G20, what you see is 2015 is a standout year for multilateralism. It represents a year wherein which the Sustainable Development Goals agenda was adopted, as also the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. And the G20 has committed itself deeply to the action plan for the SDGs, as also financing the development of the SDGs. As has been mentioned, the G20 meetings have expanded in numbers as also in scope. As I mentioned to you, 2002, we had only the finance ministers and central bank governors participating. Today, we have not only the meetings of finance ministers and central bank governors, there's also meetings of the G20 deputies, and also the G20 ministerial meetings on developmental issues, and lastly, the summit meetings. So by November 2023, we need to complete a series of meetings of working groups, Sherpa meetings, engagement group meetings, and then finally the leaders meeting. There are also these B20 meetings for business, C20 for civil society, L20 for labor groups, S20 for scientific and academic community, T20 for think tanks, women's groups, and youth leaders. It's really high levels of deliberative democracy which is at work. And the mandate has remained the original one of strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth as what has been the overwhelming mandate of the G20 through these years. And one can say that the G20 has made significant contributions in fulfilling this mandate. In formulating the roadmap for the Indian presidency, it's also important to look at what happened at the Riyadh Summit and the Rome Summit, because these were summits that were held in extraordinary times. These were not normal times. And 2022, with the 2020 to 2022, with the onset of the pandemic, an emerging debt crisis, and a slowdown in growth rates with the war in Ukraine, has made transformation to the way the global economy and also multilateralism has functioned. So it's important to look at what happened at Riyadh in 2020, and then what happened in Rome in 2021, and then what will happen now in Jakarta in 2022 before we formulate a roadmap for the Indian presidency of 2023. So the Riyadh Summit was held in November 2020, and it was the second time that the leaders met. There was also an extraordinary meeting in March on the pandemic. And there was an unprecedented number of lives were lost and economies were affected, and it necessitated significant multilateral efforts. There were also huge financing gaps in WHO's preparedness and response plans. And the focus of the Riyadh Summit was to save lives, livelihoods, and also the affected economies. The finance ministers met a record number of 7 times in 2020. They also met together with the health ministers. Then the trade and investment ministers met 3 times. The health ministers met more than 4 times. Education ministers, tourism, environment, labor and employment, digital economy ministers. Series of meetings were held before November. And in each of them, the objective was what the leaders deliberated in March 2020. The Saudi Arabians brought significant new features in multilateralism to the table. The first multi-pronged approach which they brought in was the debt service suspension initiative to be implemented by IMF and the development banks. And they ensured that the debt repayments were suspended, particularly the interest repayments, And then they formulated the common framework for debt beyond the Debt Sustainability Suspension Initiative. International economic assistance in the form of the Catastrophic Containment and Relief Trust was also established, and this benefited more than 50 countries across the globe. A rapid financing instrument was created, and the G20 health ministers worked to collaborate on the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Initiative. I would suggest each of you to take a look at the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Initiative portal. It's one of the finest portals you can see, and is indicating a daily movement of how schools are functioning across the globe in the pandemic, how many people are using masks, how the financing is going for vaccination, how many people are being vaccinated in every country. In fact, you can even drill down further to provincial level. And it is one of the finest portals that has been built. And the manner in which the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator portal has enabled COVID-19 management of the WHO has been quite significant. The education ministers of the G20 deliberated on prolonged closures of institutions. They shared best practices. Many of us were familiar with distant education, but online education for young children was far different from what distance education was. To operate virtual web rooms for children for 2 years across the globe was a huge sharing initiative. The trade ministers sought short-term measures for trade facilitation, logistics network, as also transparency. And it was the first time that an anti-corruption group was meeting to prepare a good practices compendium for combating corruption. One of the big commitments the Saudis made was to contribute $500 million for fighting the pandemic. And at that point of time, the G20 member countries pledged $21 billion in the fight against the pandemic. There was also consensus to work on COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostic tools, and extraordinary measures to support the economies and people. In fact, there were a number of news clippings of how the number of meals cooked in Kenya had come down because the pandemic had tremendous debt stress that was induced on vulnerable populations. The other areas of focus was also with regard to the future of WTO, the empowerment of youth and women, the circular carbon economy platform, reducing land degradation, and safely management of fresh water. So the four thrust areas were there: rising to the challenge together, let's build a resilient and long-lasting recovery, ensuring inclusive recovery that tackles inequalities and a sustainable future. Clearly, the roadmap ahead of the G20 Riyadh Summit was global resilience, and that exactly was what was taken up by the Italian presidency. Vaccine finance was the big challenge that the globe faced, and there also existed vaccine inequalities. And improved global governance entailed the efforts of the United Nations and multilateral institutions being bolstered. So many of these institutions had to sanction loans in a very short period of time. If you see the websites of the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, you will see in this period of 2020, 2021, a record number of loans were sanctioned within a very short period of time with very low conditionality. The WHO developed rapid response task forces, and stopping the debt pandemic along with the health pandemic represented the major challenge. Borrowing needs of several countries had skyrocketed, and more transparency in terms of budget and debt data contracts were required. The world was looking at a major recession with minus 4.4% growth, and a recovery seemed very challenging. It was in these extraordinary circumstances that the Italian presidency took over, and it outlined the principles of people, planet, and prosperity. So the first was to evolve a swift international response to the pandemic. The second was to look at a rapid recovery beyond the crisis. And the third was sustained prosperity. So this included how to bridge the digital divide, making digitalization an opportunity for all. And it worked. As Obama said way back in 2010, the very same words, it worked. The global economy came out of a recession, and witnessed a sharp economic recovery in 2021. And G20 economies initiated several policy measures. We had Brazil, Germany, Russia, United States, which extended unemployment benefits. Italy, South Africa, and Spain, which didn't have much fiscal space, took many structural reforms like tax reforms, trade liberalization, labor policies to ensure a sustainable recovery. And in the run up to the Rome Declaration and the summit meeting, there were 20 ministerial declarations and communiques. So it was a huge number of meetings. And as the chief coordinator said, there was also the extraordinary leaders meeting on Afghanistan. And the Rome Declaration noted that global economic activity was recovering at a solid pace with collective rollout of vaccines and continued policy support. How did the world leaders view this particular summit? Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi said the summit was a success, adding that cooperation is essential on issues like climate, wealth, and poverty. Prime Minister Draghi also said that the form of cooperation that we know best is multilateralism and called on all the G20 members to act swiftly together. President Biden said he encountered real eagerness for the American leadership in confronting global challenges in his meetings with world leaders. We help lead what happened here, is what he said. The American president further said there was no substitute for a meeting in person and working through disagreements. In many ways, the G20 Rome summit was a success. Consensus was achieved on several areas, and a global minimum tax of 15%, a vaccination target of 40% of the population, and a global body to respond to the crisis being further strengthened. How exactly does G20 work? And that's important to understand the number of multilateralist bodies that work with the G20. Multilateralism in the G20 works through international organizations, be it the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, the ILO, the Financial Stability Board, the Bureau of International Settlements. All of them contribute to this complex governance process. And in 2022, when there are ample signs of a slowdown in globalization, following the tragic humanitarian crisis in Eastern Europe and the wide-ranging lockdowns in China in key manufacturing hubs, multilateral cooperation is a felt need. And the G20 has had huge successes in the past. 2008, we witnessed the emergence of the world economy as stronger financial sector. 2015, the G20 could develop a massive reform in quota and governance reform in which the Paris Club was also expanded to include Korea, Brazil, and China. In 2017, although the Americans had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, the G20 continued to take forward and adopted into the Hamburg communique the issue of investing in climate, investing in growth. As we look forward to 2022 and 2023, there is commitment for the continued process of IMF governance reform in the 16th General Review of quotas. There's also the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has received commitments of more than $40 billion from 12 countries, including China and Saudi Arabia. It's also important to understand how the WTO has progressed. The WTO met in Geneva a few months back. And the Geneva package has actually given a new life to WTO. Consensus was reached on several agreements, including food security, subsidies to fisheries sector, relaxing patent regulations to secure vaccine equity, as also the relaxation in terms of moratorium on e-commerce. So these, of course, would be coming up for review in 2023. The Financial Stability Board, set up in 2008, has made a huge amount of progress, and its oversight has become much, much stronger in terms of their preparing spillover reports to understand which are the financial institutions which are too big to fail. The WHO has formulated 10 recommendations for a stronger WHO, the most important of which is the Financial Intermediary Fund to support countries against epidemics and pandemics. In fact, this fund would also address the critical gaps in terms of disease surveillance, laboratory systems, health workforce, and emergency communication. The ILO has continued its work on engaging women at work in G20 countries. The focus is on increasing women's participation in labor markets. The Indonesian presidency is quite fascinating. In fact, the finance minister of Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, used to be an advisor to used to be the executive director at the IMF in my tenure too. And her leadership has really been very strong. When you see the finance track of the Indonesian presidency, it is quite visible that the number of meetings that they have put together in terms of the finance as also the Sherpa tracks are quite significant. The Indonesian presidency has said that the world is in need of more collective action, and the issues they've taken up are global health architecture, digital transformation, and sustainable energy transformation. They've created 11 working groups, 1 initiative group, 10 engagement groups to discuss and provide recommendations. So what are the key issues that one can flag for the Indian presidency? The Honorable Prime Minister in the special meeting on Afghanistan had said that the international community has to provide Afghanistan with immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance, indicating India's willingness to work with international aid agencies that are working with displaced Afghans, particularly 1 million children at the risk of starvation in this make or break moment for the Afghan people. The Finance Minister of India in Washington, D.C. has said that ensuring equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for all is crucial for transitioning from a crisis to recovery. India has also supported the 15% tax on multinational enterprises as part of the framework on base erosion and profit shifting. Further, the Trade Minister, the Commerce and Industry Minister, Shri Piyush Goyal, has put forth India's position on actively resolving new trade barriers like vaccine differentiations or COVID passports. It's also important to understand the leadership role played by Prime Minister Modi at the G20 summit meetings. He's one of the few global leaders who has attended 8 G20 meetings. And in his initial years, he made a strong pitch against black money, and India's concerns on black money and tax avoidance have been taken on board at the G20. This development assumed significance in case of India, as it was facing difficulties in getting information on cases of suspected tax evasion from other countries. And then a global protocol was adopted for which India had worked so hard to ensure the bilateral treaty, given its concerns on money laundering. Prime Minister Modi called on multilateral development banks to enlarge their capital base and support infrastructure needs of developing countries. He has also asked G20 to promote transparency and integrity, citing India's zero tolerance policy towards corruption and black money. Further, India has supported a multilateral trade regime ahead of regional trade agreements. As has been mentioned by the Chief Coordinator, we've set ourselves a target of goal of zero carbon emissions by 2070, and also the Prime Minister has called for increase in research and development in clean and renewable energy. One of the major areas we've concentrated on has been terrorism is the principal global challenge, and there are countries that still use terrorism as an instrument of state policy. So the Prime Minister has called for a comprehensive global framework for security to combat terrorism, urging the world to speak in one voice and act in unison against terrorism. Prime Minister has also called for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism and presented a 9-point agenda on fugitive economic offenders seeking global cooperation to comprehensively deal with it. The Financial Action Task Force should be called upon to ensure timely exchange of information. On the sidelines of the G20 meetings, we've also had BRICS meetings, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In each of these meetings, the issues of reform multilateralism were discussed. At the Osaka summit, the Prime Minister presented the 5I vision to maximize digital technology for social benefits. India's initiative for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure has been a major initiative, and the National Disaster Management Authority would be playing a critical role in taking this forward. The Prime Minister has also chaired meetings of Russia, India, and China on the sidelines of Osaka Summit. He attended the Japan, America, India meetings on the sidelines of the Buenos Aires Summit, and at the Riyadh Summit, he presented his vision, which will encompass the creation of a vast talent pool, ensuring technology reaches all segments of society, transparency in systems of governance, and dealing with Mother Earth with a spirit of trusteeship. At the Rome Summit, the Prime Minister put forward the vision of One Earth, One Health, and at the session on climate change, Prime Minister Modi expressed full sensitivity towards climate mitigation. Prime Minister Modi has given great importance to SDGs in the post-recovery period, particularly in the LDCs and African countries. To conclude, let me say that the G20 Indian presidency would be one of the most significant milestone moments of Indian democracy. It's widely felt that in times when there is a crisis of multilateralism, India has the responsibility for bringing stability to a deeply divided multipolar world, crafting broader global responses to the challenges. The theme of the Indian presidency, of course, would be announced in December 2022, and the agenda could be drawn from the communiques of Riyadh, Rome, and the forthcoming Jakarta summits. Multilateral institutions have been pressing forward a certain agenda. The IMF has said that following instruments of financing remain relevant as debt challenges are pressing, because they felt that 60% of the LDCs and about 30% of the emerging market economies are facing debt stress. So although the DSSI and the common framework, which were important instruments for debt relief, have lapsed in 2021, the IMF has called for renegotiating these instruments. The Catastrophe Containment Trust Fund, through which grants are given for debt relief, after the fifth tranche that was sanctioned in 2021, did not have much resources, and the fund has said it should be continued. The same way, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust needs to be continued for financing middle-income countries, and the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust Fund for financing heavily indebted poor countries. The WHO has said that coronavirus continues to witness new waves, and the ACT accelerator needs continued financing against the 18.3 billion commitments that are needed. From India's perspective, several focus areas have been identified. I'd like to add one or two more. That is, quota and governance in international fora is an important part of the Indian governance agenda. We're also dealing with an extraordinarily challenging macroeconomic environment, with nearly 60% of the low-income countries facing unbearable debt burdens. And it is likely that the G20 will come together to establish new rules and timelines for a common framework. Further, the G20 must do everything in its power to keep inflation in range and protect the living standards for vulnerable people. Yesterday, the External Affairs Minister has said that for the first time in the history of G20, India will host G20 meetings over the year, not only in Delhi, but in every state and union territory. And the Honorable Prime Minister has said it's a unique opportunity to showcase to the world that India is not just confined to Delhi, but includes every state and union territory. I wish Ambassador Harsh Shringla and his extremely dedicated team all good wishes in this hugely challenging policy endeavor and milestone moment. Thank you very much.
We will, of course, have an opportunity to discuss it further, but invite Professor Sachin Chaturvedi to share his views with us briefly.
Chief Coordinator, Ambassador Shringla, today's speaker who just delivered very stimulating and very rich address, Mr. V. Srinivas, who has also been leading India's key initiative on good governance. And I think his focus, as Ambassador Shingla indicated in whatever exercise he gets into, brings in best. So today we had that manifested through his address, and those of us who got a copy in advance, I think this is a great read. Anybody who is interested in following process and evolution of G20. Director General Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh ji, thanks for giving this opportunity, and JS Nutan Mahbub for giving us this opportunity of connecting. Friends, Mr. Srinivas has already laid out the broad contours of how the G20 works. Chief Coordinator has given us the broad priorities which may emerge in the days to come. I just wanted to flag few issues. Time is also extremely limited now. I think first and foremost, I must mention, and I think all of us, the excellencies present here, the diplomatic community, I think all of us realize what unprecedented crisis we all are going through at the global level. All of us realize it so well. I think the whole crisis, which was confined in one region, we are seeing it getting transformed to another region. We are seeing more and more countries getting involved. We are also seeing the crisis of migration and refugees, which is also multiplying. The idea of recession and inflation in some parts of the world, the excess liquidity, and the FedEx and FedEx related operations creating further trouble. We just saw with the decision that the Reserve Bank of India has made. I think the crisis of food security is also knocking several doors, several countries, millions of people. The whole agenda of sustainable development goals, several of the goals which were actually due to be achieved by 2024 have been derailed. By an estimation with my research team, we are seeing the delay is likely to be of 6 to 7 years. And in that perspective, the whole plan for mitigation and also adaptation, I think, are also going to be derailed. And they would be derailed to such an extent that the cost would be extremely high for the world community to achieve sustainable development goals. The whole idea of three C's with the COVID conflict and climate, I think these unprecedented challenges are something that all multilateral platforms are grappling. G20 is no exception. We have seen the limited outcome from the World Trade Organization. We are seeing the discussion on WIPO and other platforms, including WHO, not going very far. The declining trend and commitment for creating global public goods is another major challenge that we are seeing. The whole challenge in terms of the new technologies that are there, the excessive intrusion that is happening with the new technologies and the Mama, the Meta, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google's parent company, Alphabet. We are seeing the rise in terms of how some of those challenges are there. And these challenges are unprecedented. They are all coming together. And I think raising the fundamental question in terms of how we cope up from one crisis to another, how do we bring in the whole component of development in our central narrative? And that's what Ambassador Shingla, I think, was hinting at as India's priority for bringing development back in our sharp focus. The complete disappearance under the Washington Consensus and its influence of excessive monetization of our development narrative requires a completely new approach, a fresh start on how do we bring development more inclusive? How do we address development in such a way that it takes everyone along? And from that point of view, what kind of business narration that is needed? There might be several initiatives. If you recall, and as Mr. Srinivas explained, the genesis came out of financial crisis. It was great contribution from South Korea in 2011 that we added the development pillar. So the idea was that financial crisis cannot be solved without addressing the triggers, and the triggers come in from failure of addressing development. And that's why in the millennium, when we finished the Millennium Development Goals, we went on to the trajectory of Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goals are different from Millennium Development Goals on three counts. Number one, that we realize that development is the center, that no one should be left behind. The whole trouble of leaving people behind led to several countries with lot of challenges. The rise in terrorism, the rise in several major global challenges is in terms of how development hasn't reached. But there are many other commitments. I'm not excluding that. I'm very much keeping that upfront. But as an economist, I see that as also one of the reasons as to why development is not inclusive. And we, as a global community, in 2011 decided to went on to the track for sustainable development goal negotiations. So that's the first difference between MDG and SDG. The second is this whole shift from quantity to quality. Our idea of not just hospitals, but the quality of hospitals, not just education, but quality education. And these kind of dimensions have contributed, not just resources, but to access to resources and quality resources. And this transition that happened from MDG to SDG actually laid out the new contours for our development. The consistent efforts that have been made by several presidencies of G20 have tried their best, but now I think time has come that we revisit them. We revisit them with collective glasses of development. How do we make our development more inclusive? Indonesia has done remarkable job in this pressing crisis. They have tried their best to bring everyone along, as Ambassador Shingla indicated, in terms of how we collectively address challenges emanating out of trade, investment, technology, and finance, all the four sectors. And we find this in terms of the new initiatives that are there. Within agriculture, if you look at the flagship initiative that France during their presidency launched in 2011 was something related to agriculture market information system, which was largely to address the price volatility that we were ending up with. But what's happening? We could not track down the global buffers that were available. And we have seen countries that have faced huge food crisis that is there. The global architecture that Mr. Srinivas alluded to in terms of revisiting IMF and IMF conditionalities that are there for countries that Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh referred to in our own neighborhood in Sri Lanka. We are seeing how Nepal and increasingly now Bangladesh, the fiscal crisis, the monetary crisis is deepening. So it's not just about G20 countries, but it is also about the countries who are associated with these economies. After India's presidency, it would be Brazil. And after Brazil, it would be South Africa. If that series goes on, we have a unique opportunity to re-strengthen our commitment for collective development. And I think that's what emerging economies can bring on table. We have seen ups and downs, and I think we have seen the wider global challenges that are there. But it is equally important for us to see how do we bring back the SDG-related commitments that are there. Several instruments have also failed. The whole idea of SDR reforms, why we could not bring in more energy in SDR, is something that we all have to collectively think about. After the COVID crisis, when we decided to give $650 billion by the IMF for the global economy to assist, can you guess how much percentage the LDCs have got? Not even 9%. And this is what we need to revisit in terms of how the global financial crisis is supporting countries that require support. The total amount that has gone to all emerging economies, developing countries, least developed countries from IMF is just 42%. So this global inequity, the dominance of narratives from specific countries, I think require revisit. Ambassador Shingla very rightly emphasized on idea of sustainable development. And they, again, at the COP26, we decided to have revisit the idea of $100 billion which were promised. And they haven't appeared anyway. The whole idea of our restructuring the RST that was required for us to address in terms of both our partnership and our address as we define and redefine SDR, I think it is important for us to see how global financial institutions reposition themselves. And that repositioning is highly, I think, pressing for most of the countries as they are grappling with the challenge of debt management. The DSSI's failure in 2020 is not very different from what we saw in 1997, what we saw in case of several countries during 2002, but we did not see that in 2007 and 8 and 9 when specific countries faced that challenge. So we need to see how do we make world reliable. The whole IMF's Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, CCRT, also requires revisit as we witness the challenges of the lower middle income countries, the LMICs. The whole idea of supporting them with the 10 to 20% assistance is something that is bothering all of us in terms of how financial issues are being addressed. Since I'm also on the board of the Central Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India, we are grappling with the major challenge in terms of how foreign exchange reserves are to be parked, in what way they are to be parked, and how they are to be productively assessed. And that's where emerging economies have huge responsibility. The developed economies also have responsibility in terms of how do they adjust the inflation pressure, the excess liquidity that I referred to. America's one step or misstep creates a huge ripple effect across other economies. The whole effort for de-dollarization, the whole effort for new payment gateway architectures, and India's accomplishment, something that Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh alluded to in terms of digitalization of the financial economy, I think is testimony to the new efforts that the countries can bring in on table. India's presidency of G20, I think, should reflect that and should bring in that equity, that inclusion, and that access to the global resources that we are looking at. India, along with many other emerging economies, has also emerged as a major development partner with several countries. The quantums have multiplied. The institutional architectures have also evolved. Brazil has been one of the leaders among the developing countries with ABC and have been contributing in terms of how structured development assistance can take place and how that can go in terms of the very ideas that are extremely important. And that's where the development finance and its role is important. India's presidency on the finance track would have to address some of these challenges. The track which is much more important and interesting for several of us, unfortunately, has to deal with very small percentage of budgetary resources, which is the Sherpa track. And the Sherpa track again has two tracks, as Mr. Srinivas explained. One is, of course, the government to government, which is the working group track. The second track within Sherpa track is about the engagement groups, bringing in civil society, think tanks, research institutions, youth, and many others. Almost 11 or 12 such engagement groups. They bring in the huge vibrancy to the G20. They bring in the public connect of the G20. And that's where there is huge scope for countries to connect, to bring in their expertise, their specialization, and their expectation from the way G20 is managed. The whole idea would very much depend in terms of how we look at the concerns that are coming out from Africa. India's presidency would also bring in Africa, I'm sure, in several different ways. The whole idea of global tax coordination, the whole idea of illicit financial flows that are taking resources out of Africa would be equally important and a concern not only for finance track but also for the Sherpa track. And this, I think, would be important for us to see how we share benefits of agriculture, health. The whole vaccine Metri program is our commitment that Indian presidency, I'm sure, would very much like to extrapolate to other sectors, including the sectors where manufacturing capacities are important. The collective commitment for SDGs is not just about we achieving SDGs, it's also about the whole concept of localization of development. And I think India's presidency of G20 should emphasize in terms of how we localize development. We reduce import dependence, we enhance local production, local capacity building, and that probably would take away the huge emphasis we ended up in the decade of 90s and early part of this century on external trade. Trade which is unidirectional, trade where we only end up as importers. There's nothing bad being an importer, but what is completely derailing in the process is the local employment opportunity, local production capacity, and their ability to cope up in terms of the larger development requires that are there. And I think from that point of view, it is important for us to identify how do we go forward. I am not so much concerned about what issues India would bring in at the center, but I'm 100% concerned in terms of how the presidencies that would come after India would take forward the points and what points we raise here in consultation with Indonesia to take it forward in terms of bringing G20 much more inclusive process, making it much more responsive in terms of how this sequencing is done, particularly when we are talking about the economic reforms. The whole crisis of a structural adjustment program was in terms of sequencing, how we open up market. That was the debate India had, and Paul Sweezy, as he emphasized, in terms of sequencing of reforms, how we open up. Unfortunately, neither IMF nor World Bank paid any attention to that. Now the same crisis is knocking our door, this time in terms of sequencing of the trade and environment. The whole emphasis in the spring meeting of the IMF and World Bank calling upon the multilateral development banks to stop funding of the coal plants is something which is completely unminding the crisis that developmental challenges are posing for several developing countries. We need to see how, with net zero target of 2070, we can still get some time to sequence this process. And that, I think, would be extremely important in terms of how this sequencing is done when the agenda is laid out. But in my view, I think development would be a major challenge. I would stop here. Thank you.
Well, we've had two speakers with a huge depth of knowledge, and they've shared with us very comprehensively their views on the subject at hand. Mr. Srinivas, of course, who has gone into fairly extensive research on the issue, has taken us through what the G20 represents, both historically in terms of India's own contributions, but also the achievements of the G20, which I think are important. And if I can extrapolate from what he said, I think the G20 has come up with a number of initiatives, but also a number of solutions to global problems that have been on the table. The debt service suspension initiative, the taxation of multinationals, the provision of a fund of $11 trillion to respond to the pandemic, the portal, the COVID-19 tools and accelerator portal. I think all of these have been initiatives that have responded to the need of the hour. The situation in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation, I would say as we go along, the Indonesian presidency's emphasis on recovery. We ourselves have worked closely with Indonesia on many of its priorities, and clearly, I think we will continue in the same. We'll continue to follow many of their initiatives. One thing that does come out in the discussions is, or rather two things. One, of course, is that today I think growth is flatlining, or in many senses, we are looking also at growth that is on a downward curve. We've had obviously serious issues with inflation. Both our speakers have extensively dwelled on this. What can the G20 do to provide solutions to the economic situation on a worldwide basis? And of course, whether we can look at, as some of our, again, the speakers have pointed out, growth which is both inclusive and sustainable, and with development, growth with decarbonization that was also talked about. What are the solutions before us? The other aspect, of course, is that the crisis created by COVID, exacerbated by certain geopolitical and geoeconomic trends, has clearly put a lot of vulnerable economies into serious financial and debt sustainability situations. These, of course, including our own neighborhood, these economies and these, I would say, situations are, in some senses, a warning signal, and what can the G20 do to respond to some of this? Are there more systemic issues that we need to look at? Are there issues in terms of solutions, as we have seen before, that can emerge? These are issues, I think, that are important. So I think time is short, but I don't know. I'll just check with Vijay whether we have time for a couple of questions.
Maybe a couple.
Yeah, maybe just two questions, and we could request our panelists to provide some of the responses. So let's open it up to any two questions that anyone may have before we conclude this session. Two or three, yes. And of course, if there are none, then I would say that both the interventions have been so comprehensive that we would not need to have any. Master? Yeah, please go ahead. Is there a mic? Just one second. I think Master here. Come back.
Thank you very much. I'm the ambassador of the Netherlands. Thank you very much for wonderful presentations. And as was said, I wish all well to a very challenging presidency in very difficult times. One question, because as you said, we have the G20, the Youth 20, the T20, etc., etc. Are you also thinking about better connect these different tracks with each other? So we have issues in the T20, also in the G20 and the Youth 20 and the Business 20. So a better connection between the different tracks. Could you say something about this? Thank you very much.
So I'll request our panelists, of course, the ambassador who's been G20 for the Netherlands, the Sherpa for the Netherlands, has a very good knowledge of this issue. Go ahead.
I think it's a very valid point, because there are several civil society fora, there's a business fora, and they're not fully integrated into the government engagements. I guess it could not be possible in the last 2 years. They started sometime in Buenos Aires, and after that the pandemic set in. So now Jakarta would be a better venue to and I see from the various reports that are coming out from the Bali meetings that there is cohesiveness being established. We just had the Youth 20 in Bali, in which several government nominees also participated. In fact, Government of India sent its Secretary Youth Affairs along with the Youth 20. So this convergence that you are recommending would be very vital in the coming years. I think it takes time to build this kind of convergence. The governance models have been fairly well established. The finance track is well established. They added the health track to it. Then the education, trade, these have come in, and anti-corruption has come in. Now the civil society groups are also being integrated into it. So, and there is the international institutions which are proceeding on their own track. That's what makes it for 190 meetings. But let me say one thing. 2015 was said to be the watershed year of multilateralism. I'm sure under Ambassador Harsh Shringla's leadership, 2023 promises to be a much better one, because there's nobody more qualified to be a multilateralist than him in our country today.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. I think very valid point you have raised. I think it's important that all the engagement groups are on the same page and do not reinvent the wheel. So I think the chief coordinator is already planning a couple of initiatives in this regard, and I'm sure there would be a sort of convergence, some sort of dialogue among various engagement groups. Some of that, as soon as the announcement is made of possible institutions, agencies, I'm sure that convergence would definitely appear.
Just to add a quick point to this is that the G20, of course, as has been pointed out, deals with a very diverse range of issues, and I would say that very often, because they're sectoral, there's no I would say underpinning framework that operates there. It's only when it goes to the summit level that all of the various decisions and all of the various outcomes flow into the summit. But the summit can only, I would say, summarize many of the most important, I would say, deliberations. Perhaps this point about trying to coordinate and bring in more synergies between the engagement groups is something that is very, as both our speakers pointed out, very, very valid. And thank you for making that point. We go to the gentleman there who had a question, I think.
Myself is S.S. Bakhdi. Well, all the worthy speakers have referred to different crises, financial crises which have occurred 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I would like to know as to what is the, just very briefly, not in detail, as to how or what is the reason for the financial crisis to happen, say to begin with the last one of 2008 and 2009. What was the reason of that financial crisis? Secondly, the interlocutors have also referred to multilateralism time and again. Well, with an organization which is called United Nations Organization, it has become a weak and ineffectual angel, beating in the wide its luminous wings in vain. And people have seen it in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years, 40 years. So amidst this wrangling, do you think this world is going to move very smoothly, harmoniously with the G20 or G10 or G7? There is a number of nomenclatures, So any interlocutor can respond briefly.
Let me be very brief on this.
Automatically. Yeah, leave it. It'll come on its own.
Okay. Yeah. There's a book of mine, India's Relations with the IMF, on the rack. Please pick up a copy. It depicts every financial crisis from 1932, the Great Depression, till date. And it gives you more than 50 pages on how the 2008 financial crisis happened. So just pick up a copy. It's just across the board, and it'll answer the query. The rest of it, there are multiple groups, G7, G24, G77. India's been a member of G24, G77. But we went from G24 to G20. I think G20 today represents the foremost body of multilateralism in the global fora. And it's very important that this huge institution that has been set up after considerable efforts, led by the United States and supported by all the other nations, is sustained in its most vibrant form. And that is what the Indian presidency would look forward to.
Or should we take one? I think we are running out of time, and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi also has to leave us for another urgent meeting.
Ambassador Javara had something.
Okay, let us take the last question, and then we wind up. Other questions you can always post to our panelists at the coffee break. Ambassador, please go ahead.
Yeah, I am the High Commissioner of the Gambia. My question is a very short and simple one. It has to do with the composition of G20. If you look at the composition, there is only one African country, that is South Africa. Why so? And during the presidency of India, 2023, would you look into expanding the number of African countries to this body?
I frankly don't know.
But I mean, it's a very valid point, and I think one aspect that we have to look into, of course, is that the African Union and NEPAD are permanent invitees to the G20. From what I've seen, most presidencies also invite other African countries to participate in the G20. But I fully agree, Ambassador, that a stronger voice for Africa at the G20 and other international fora is very critical, and we will certainly take the very valid point you have made into consideration. I see Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh has pointed out that we have a hard stop at 5:30. Our panelists, at least, Secretary Srinivasan, will be outside to further continue our discussions. So let's conclude here by vote of thanks to our very eminent panelists, and also thanking the ICWA for this great initiative, and for you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, sir. May I now invite everyone to join us for high tea. Thank you.